Welcome to my YouTube channel. Please subscribe my YouTube channel. The corporation isn't just guilty of misleading the public. It actually handed over cash to the family of an official at Hamas, an evil terrorist organization. Yesterday, the BBC's chairman Samir Shah said the Sari saga is a dagger to the heart of its claim to be impartial. No other broadcaster or heavily regulated newspaper would get away with such a debacle. Yet the BBC is holding only a lengthy, low-key internal review. Accountability remains negligible. During the same appearance before MPs, Mr. Shah said he is troubled by the forced prosecution of non-payers of the license fee, often in secret courts. The ex-presenter has since been living off his £300,000 a year, gold-plated BBC pension. Yesterday it was revealed that Edwards, displaying the classic control moves of the true narcissist, had initially indicated he might be willing to reimburse the public, only to change his mind and keep all the money. We expect nothing better from a man who exploited the suffering of children and betrayed his family and fans. J.D. Vance later backtracked, claiming his reference to random countries with 20,000 troops was not aimed at the Brits. For the avoidance of doubt, let us spell out the sacrifices made by Britain since the horrors of 9/11 in 2001. In Afghanistan, 457 of our brave troops died fighting the Taliban. Another 179 were killed fighting insurgency in Iraq. Each hero died for causes led by an American president. The BBC's Gaza documentary scandal, a breach of trust? For decades, the BBC has been a cornerstone of British broadcasting, funded by viewers who have no choice but to hand over £169 a year for a TV license. In return, they expect unbiased reporting, integrity, and a commitment to truth. But recent controversies surrounding the BBC's coverage of Gaza have left many questioning whether they are getting what they paid for, or if they are simply funding a machine of selective narratives and political bias. The latest scandal surrounding a BBC Gaza documentary has ignited a firestorm of outrage. Viewers have been left sickened, not just by the content of the program itself, but by the sense that they are being misled, manipulated, and force-fed a narrative that suits the broadcaster's agenda rather than reflecting the full, unvarnished truth of the conflict. The BBC's responsibility to its viewers. The BBC is supposed to be a bastion of journalistic integrity. As a publicly funded entity, it has a duty to provide impartial reporting, ensuring that both sides of any given conflict are represented fairly. Yet, when it comes to Gaza, there has been growing concern that the BBC has abandoned its commitment to balance, instead choosing to highlight certain aspects of the situation while downplaying or omitting others. For those forced to pay the license fee, this feels like an insult. The BBC is not a private company that viewers can choose to support or boycott. It is a legally mandated institution that every TV owner in the UK must fund. And when the BBC is seen to be failing in its most fundamental obligation, telling the truth, people are understandably furious. The documentary that sparked outrage. The BBC's recent documentary on Gaza was meant to provide an in-depth look at the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the region. However, from the moment it aired, it faced accusations of bias. Critics argue that the program failed to present the full context of the conflict, selectively showcasing stories that fit a particular narrative while neglecting key facts that might challenge it. Many felt the documentary portrayed Hamas in a softer light than expected, failing to sufficiently scrutinize the role the militant group plays in the conflict. There were also accusations that the suffering of Israeli victims of violence was downplayed in comparison to the suffering of Palestinians. While the latter's struggles are undoubtedly important to report on, the selective nature of the coverage left many viewers feeling that the BBC was not telling the whole story. A history of bias? This is not the first time the BBC has been accused of bias in its reporting on Israel and Palestine. Critics have long argued that the broadcaster's coverage of the Middle East conflict often lacks the nuance and impartiality expected from a publicly funded news organization. Instances where Israeli voices have been cut short or edited in ways that shift the narrative have been widely discussed on social media. Meanwhile, there have been multiple occasions where Hamas spokespeople have been given platforms to share their viewpoints with minimal pushback from BBC journalists. Such trends raise serious questions about the editorial policies guiding BBC reporting. Are journalists at the BBC truly committed to impartiality, Or are they influenced by ideological leanings that shape their coverage? If the latter is true, then license fee payers have every right to demand change. The public backlash. The public reaction to the Gaza documentary scandal has been explosive. Social media erupted with furious posts from viewers who felt betrayed by the broadcaster. Many called for immediate reforms, demanding greater accountability and transparency in how the BBC approaches its coverage of global conflicts. Some viewers have even taken more drastic steps, calling for the abolition of the TV license altogether. The logic is simple: if the BBC cannot be trusted to provide fair and balanced news, why should the public be forced to pay for it? The backlash has not been limited to everyday viewers. Politicians and public figures have also weighed in, with several MPs demanding an inquiry into the BBC's editorial decisions regarding the documentary. Others have urged the government to reconsider the mandatory nature of the TV license, arguing that a subscription-based model would allow people to opt out of funding a broadcaster they no longer trust. The BBC's response. In response to the uproar, the BBC has defended its documentary, insisting that it was produced with the highest journalistic standards. The broadcaster claims that it strives for impartiality and that any accusations of bias are unfounded. However, for many viewers, these reassurances ring hollow. The BBC's history of selective reporting, particularly on the Israel-Palestine conflict, has eroded public trust to such an extent that mere words are not enough to repair the damage. If the BBC wants to restore faith in its journalism, it needs to take concrete action, starting with greater transparency in how it chooses and presents stories. What needs to change? If the BBC is serious about regaining public trust, it must take several steps. Commit to true impartiality. The BBC must ensure that its reporting is genuinely balanced, providing equal scrutiny to all parties involved in conflicts like Gaza. That means asking tough questions of Hamas leaders just as it does of Israeli officials. Independent oversight. An external body should be appointed to regularly review the BBC's coverage of contentious issues, ensuring that no biases seep into reporting. License fee reform. Given the widespread anger over the Gaza documentary, there is a strong argument for rethinking the BBC's funding model. A voluntary subscription-based approach would give viewers the choice whether or not to support the broadcaster. Accountability for editorial decisions. When accusations of bias emerge, the BBC should conduct transparent reviews and publicly address concerns, rather than issuing blanket denials. The future of the BBC. The Gaza documentary scandal has done significant damage to the BBC's reputation. For many license fee payers, this was the final straw in a long history of perceived bias and selective reporting. The BBC stands at a crossroads. It can either continue down its current path, risking further public outrage and calls for its abolition, or it can take meaningful steps to restore trust and credibility. The choice is theirs, but if they choose wrongly, the British public may soon decide they no longer want to be forced to fund an institution that no longer represents them.